Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about my guest today. My guest today is Alison M. Allison is a conceptual historian of medicine and health at Western Sydney University. She is the author of several books and many journal articles about the history of sexuality. She is now working on two new research projects, one on the history of digestive health and the other on the history of sexual aging. She's also a master's competitive weightlifter and a follower of the ancestral health self-practices. We had an awesome interview on the topic of menopause, and I hope you learn a lot. Also remember, PaleoFX is just around the corner, and they're running an amazing special right now. Get 2 tickets for the price of 1. So if you haven't got your ticket to this amazing conference, click on the link on the show notes. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello everyone, super excited to have here my friend Alison M. You know, I met Allison a couple of months ago at the Ancestral Health Symposium. It was funny because I was standing outside talking to Aaron Blightsdale, and she was there. We were just having fun, and then all of a sudden I go, "Oh, I gotta go to this lecture," and she was the one lecturing. So that was kind of cool. And then it's a very interesting subject. Her lecture was on menopause. And me working at an endocrinology practice and seeing how, well, I'll let you explain it. And I'd love to go deep into like the societal and then like actually the physiological, what's really happening and all of the different changes that happen to a person that is going through this experience. But before we start, Allison, what is your hero story? How did you end up in this health space writing about female hormones?
Well, I don't know if I have a hero story. I'm a historian. There aren't many of us, so I guess it's maybe a bit of a niche story. So I've always been interested in the history of medicine, and possibly, about 10 years ago, I started to develop some new interests from doing some biomedical science study, which is not something most historians do. And that made me think about some questions to do with the history of health and physiology that, possibly haven't really been thought of much in the history of medicine. So that's kind of shifted my focus a little bit. And I became interested in the idea of how societies change their attitudes to sexual behavior in aging, like how we should be sexually as we get older. And as I started to dig around and trying to work out when some of our modern concepts about that emerged, I realized that the concept of menopause was itself a quite novel one that only appeared in the 19th century. So then I became very interested in what might have produced that change, why suddenly you have the concept at that moment and not at any previous time.
I think you presented such a compelling story because you started the whole conversation with the story of the word and actually like this change in behavior. Can you give my listeners a little bit of background on the clinical origins? Because this is a process that has happened evolutionarily for many, many years, but it was never like recorded or identified. So what's the origin or when was it first described?
Well, the term menopause was invented at the beginning of the 19th century. As I said, it was a number of French doctors who were interested in kind of overturning another concept that was around at that time and which they saw as not properly scientific. And that other concept referred to a climacteric, a kind of critical age. And it was thought that both men and women reached this around the age around 45 to 50 years. And that it was a period of vulnerability to health disorders of various kinds. And these French doctors wanted to create a new term that didn't imply any kind of pathology. It just meant the end of menses, menopause. And so the concept was designed to be non-pathological, to just really just refer to women stopping their menstrual cycle and nothing else. except that as they wrote about it, they couldn't help then filling the concept with lots of symptoms. So that in essence, it ended up being very similar to the concept of the climacteric, except that now was quite female specific.
When you talk about climacteric changes, at least in Western medicine, it's actually referring to hot flashes.
Yeah, so that you still hear that term being used in the medical literature, but it's not the current scientific term. It's one that still hangs around.
So after your talk, I approached you and I said, I want to bring you into the podcast because I want to talk about menopause not as a clinical or morbidity age or stage. What were some of the symptomologies or what were some of the preconceived bad effects of reaching this climacteric or menopausal age?
Well, it really varies across time and place. That's the interesting thing. So in the current literature, there's a differentiation. In Western cultures, women tend to experience things like the hot flush. The research in Japan suggests it doesn't really work that way for women there, that they're more inclined to experience feelings of coldness. In the 19th century, you have some reportage of things like hot flushes, weight gain, mood disorders, and sleep problems, similar to the things that are part of the symptomatology today. But you also have things of which women complain that are no longer very common symptoms. Uterine hemorrhages were one of the main symptoms of menopause in the 19th century, and there could be reasons for that to do with the way people were treating themselves medically with purgative herbs and things. So it really does seem to depend on a few different things. So there's some interesting comparative anthropological research as well, looking at what happens to women in Pakistan who grow up in rural villages, who are not exposed to a concept of menopause, and then they migrate to London. There is a very distinct shift that occurs in women's menopause symptoms depending on whether they grow up in that Pakistani village or whether they reach menopausal age in London. Invariably, just having that concept, but also perhaps having the modern urban lifeway. Women in the London context report lots of menopause symptoms. Women in the Pakistani concept report nothing. They ask what happens when your menses ended, nothing, it just stopped. And funnily enough, the French doctors who I looked at who first were describing menopause at the beginning of the 19th century reported something very similar, which is that when they were treating middle-class women in the urban centres, this is where they were hearing all of the reports of symptomatology. When they asked peasant women in the countryside what happened when your menses finished, again, they got blank looks, or they had people say to them, well, it was very good because I didn't have to worry about menstruation anymore. I didn't have to worry about getting pregnant. And so they had absolutely no concept of it as a negative thing.
Why?
It's complicated. It's very, very, very complicated. You have to consider if somebody is almost constantly pregnant or breastfeeding, they don't necessarily have regular periods anyway. So the idea that there's something dramatically new that's happening once they stop isn't so clear. And you also, of course, in those rural contexts, typically have a lot of fresh air, a lot of physical activity, a lot of fresh produce in terms of the diet. When women are moving to the urban centres, you're typically seeing them become sedentary, increase their alcohol intake, stop exercising, and eating a lot of refined carbohydrates. That is a really clear shift that occurs at the beginning of the 19th century that I think really needs to be taken into account as well.
Now, you mentioned having lots of kids or being constantly pregnant. Have you in your research have you seen like a breaking point where like, oh, this is the amount of kids that would predispose you to menopausal symptoms?
Oh, no, there's no relationship between those things. So, you don't have more menopausal symptoms, you have more children. That's
the opposite. Like there are some studies that say that women that have less children are more predisposed to things like cancer. like breast cancer and ovarian and cervical cancer. And that kind of makes sense in a couple of ways. For example, if you're having multiple kids, you have less estrogen cycles.
Yeah, you have a break from it.
You're getting a break, and then you're gonna have some lactation, which also decreases your estrogen, and that the less cycles that you have, the less chances you have of activating one of those estrogen receptor genes and having some cancer. So having kids is protective.
Yeah, it's one variable. It's a minor effect, like a lot of things. I mean, if you have lots of kids and you smoke, drink too much, and don't exercise, you can probably cancel that out pretty quickly.
And plus the stressor of having a lot of kids predisposes you to other things.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different thing, isn't it, to have children in the modern world where we don't have the support networks, we don't have the familial structures that mean that a lot of people are sharing that responsibility. So I think actually the impact on women and families to have children now is not what it was in terms of stress levels.
So in this observation, where the Pakistan women, would stop having periods, and they were like, okay, yeah, that just happened, and then the ones that came to London and were exposed to this idea of this sickness, quote unquote, called menopause. Are there any, like there's a huge study on Aboriginals in Australia that were taken from their Aboriginals and taken to the city, and then they developed diabetes. So you believe that this menopausal effects were from the transition from a rural or more primitive or more ancestral way of living into the modernization?
It's probably a few things. I'd be surprised if it's just all about physiological change, but I also don't think it's just the concepts that are impacting people. So, I certainly don't want to imply that, for women experiencing these things, it's all in our heads and, we don't really have anything going on physiologically. I think it's a complicated thing, and there are so many things that change all at once, both at the level of bodily lifeways and at the level of concepts, that you really have to take the whole package together and see it as a sort of psychosocial thing.
So you mentioned something about corsets and purgatives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there were some unique pressures that women had on their bodies in the 19th century that could well have had an impact on their experience of menopause too, and things that we might not need to worry about so much now, but that were certainly important for them. So corsets were very common in the 19th century. Some of them pulled very tight, and they do, of course, restrict blood flow in the abdominal cavity. So all of the organs of the abdomen end up being squashed together, and blood flow is decreased. There was a great resistance to corsets in the 19th century. There were many doctors who wrote about the dangers of wearing them, who talked about the atrophy of all of the core musculature that happens with chronic corset wearing. And there's absolutely no doubt that will impact reproductive health, that it will affect the function of the uterus, and be more inclined probably for women wearing those to experience pain with menstruation and pain with fibroid growth, possibly a trigger also for the hemorrhages. But we also know that people commonly thought that if they didn't have a period, they should try and stimulate it with the use of purgative herbal remedies that were common in the pharmacies of Europe at that time.
And that was one of the things that was happening. Like you said, one of the symptoms of menopause was spontaneous bleeding.
Yeah, it seems like a strange contradiction, doesn't it? Because if you're in menopause, why would you be having any bleeding? But it's one thing to have a regular period. It's another thing to have a sudden massive gush of blood that saturates everything in the vicinity. So this is what women were dealing with, and unexpected as well.
Have you dug deep into the reason why Japanese women experience coldness?
Yeah, look, there are a few different hypotheses that people have floated around. I mean, in the Japanese diet, of course, there's a tremendous amount of soy products. These in themselves have a regulatory effect on estrogen receptors. That is, if you read the literature on soy, it's very conflicted. So there are some people who think that soy is very good for menopausal women, that it helps to regulate the receptors in a beneficial way. Others see them as potentially endocrine disruptors that might block the receptor to endogenous estrogen and stop its uptake. And so, in effect, increase menopausal symptoms. But the anecdotal evidence from many women seems to be that they're helpful. I don't know what your experience has been, but
well, if you look at the literature, like you said, it is very conflicting. I don't eat soy. As a guy, I don't want those estrogen receptors to be.
You don't want those man boobs.
Yeah, no, I don't want those man boobs. But there is some really cool data about being like estrogen-like compounds that bind to the receptor, but might not activate it. And there is pretty good mechanistic data on that. But anytime we, as scientists, we discover a mechanism and we try to extrapolate that mechanism to living organisms, we are wrong. and like a great example of that would be like cyanocobalamin, which binds to the B12 receptor. And then if you measure blood levels of B12 with someone that takes cyanocobalamin,
they'll be high.
They'll be high, but it's holding onto a receptor, not activating it. So I think that eating soy and hoping, like crossing your fingers that it's going to bind to the receptor and not activating it it's kind of dangerous, at least for guys. The data, the observational data and outcome data seem to agree with that. But lack of evidence is not evidence against. So not having absolute data, it's not gonna make my decision any bit easier or not. So I don't think there's anything in soy that is endogenously protective or something like that, or necessary for life.
Right.
So I choose not to eat it.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of the same. I mean, there are other things to eat, and I don't feel great when I eat it. My feeling is it's not something that's helpful for me at the endocrinological level. I know some women who swear by it and say that they feel that it really helps them manage hot flushes.
I have a friend who is vegan, and we were talking about that, and I was talking about like, well, the data is not crystal clear, and her answer was, if I leave soy, then I leave my number one source of protein.
Yeah, for vegans, it's more important. They don't have that many options.
So then you have to weigh your choices, and sometimes you're gonna take the good with the bad, I guess. But as a grain that is not a complete protein, that is tightly bound with lectins and things like that, there are better sources of protein for me that are probably going to be less inflammatory, so I choose not to eat it. Now, in Australia, you're pretty westernized. What is the public perception of menopause?
Well, I think it's pretty similar to in the US. So you have a spectrum of attitudes. You have some women who are determined for it not to be an issue, and they're not interested in buying into any of the worry about it. And you have some women who worry tremendously about it and dread it, and then when it begins, they respond very negatively to any indication that things might be changing. And I think physiologically there are big differences too. There are some people who just genetically don't appear to have much that changes as they go through that transition, and for other women it's quite dramatic change at a number of different levels, neurotransmitter balance metabolically and all sorts of things. So I think a lot does depend on lifestyle. I think there is a lot that women can do to make menopause easier. And I don't know how well that is known. I think there are many people who think that they're just resigned to it being a period of weight gain and mood disorder and sleep dysregulation, but then they're also eating junk food, not exercising, not practicing any kind of sleep hygiene. So.
Did you dig deep into hormone replacement therapy?
Yeah. So I actually want to write a whole chapter in the book that I'm working on this about hormone replacement therapy, because I think it does something very interesting to our attitudes to menopause, namely in that when you read the historical literature on it, one thing that is very absent in the 19th century, you don't see anyone talking about sexual aging as producing a loss of libido. Nobody talks about loss of libido with menopause in the 19th century. And then very suddenly in the mid-20th, around about the time that we start to get hormone replacement therapies being developed as a pharmacological agent, we have this concept that your libido will decline with age, and unless you take HRT, you won't have any sex drive.
And it's curious when you compare the lifespan of a male and versus the lifespan of a woman. Is and it's funny because now you start maybe a couple of centuries later, but now you start seeing the term andropause.
Oh yeah, no, andropause was thrown around from early in the 20th century.
Really? Yeah. Well,
and actually, it kind of never went away. So before menopause, the idea of the climacteric was applied to both men and women. So it was thought equally to affect men. And then the concept of menopause displaced the idea of men having anything because they don't have a menses, so how can they have a menopause?
And we can produce sperm into old age.
Right. And it was clear that men could continue to father children well into old age, whereas women had a very clear cutting off point. But throughout the 19th century, there were a number of doctors who were, they were in the minority, but they were constant, who would pip up saying, no, actually men do have a menopause as well. It's not like women's and it's a little bit later, but they too will suffer a period of vulnerability where their old disorders come back to haunt them and they gain weight and they have problems with mood, and they were identifying something in men as well.
In your studies, what's the characteristics of someone entering menopause, both physiologically and emotionally, and what defines a woman entering menopause?
Oh, it's very complicated because it's not just one moment, is it? I mean, this is the funny thing. We talk about menopause.
Oh, no, it's very easy. It's 1 year without a period.
Yes, except that how many women just definitively stop all at once? That's actually quite unusual.
Hey, medicine was written by guys, and we like simplicity. So we define this very archaic definition of menopause, and constantly I get patients and they ask me, so can you draw some blood and tell me if I'm menopausal? And maybe they're looking for, FSH, LH shift or something like that. But no, clinically, the definition of a woman in menopause is 1 year without a period, which is like the most archaic way of describing anything.
We've had some ambiguity because the term menopause means the point where you no longer menstruate. So that is what the term is supposed to refer to. But the symptomatology that fills the literature, which is all of what is written about menopause, is effectively referring to perimenopause. It's effectively referring to the transition toward that stoppage. And so when we talk about menopause, we're not referring to just one thing. We talk about postmenopausal women. And so a lot of that literature that looks at increased bone loss, cognitive effects of the sudden decline, drop in estrogen once there is no more menstruation. That all refers to the period when it's definitively ended. But there can be a 10-year long period in which the menses is sporadic. It's no longer regular. So this is quite common, that women don't definitively stop all at once. They begin to have irregular periods. And they might then not have a period for several years and then suddenly have one. So this is actually quite common. And so the idea that there's just this definitive moment, it's not quite right.
It's and I agree completely. And then because of this definitive moment, there are, different practitioners that will do different things when it comes even to HRT, where, if you have menopausal-like symptoms past the 5 years after your last period has been gone for a year, they won't treat you or they won't give you any support because there isn't, the window has closed, which is like the weirdest thing ever because, it's not like your pituitary completely shuts off at one point. It's an organic thing that might be pulsating differently into different at different stages of your life. Secondly, so that's at one spectrum. That's at one spectrum. People saying never estrogen, never, testosterone replacement therapy, never. And then on the other side, I don't know if you dug into this, there are practitioners that want to stimulate your cycle way past a physiological age. And that has its problems too.
Yeah. Look, I think, I don't know, hormones are exquisitely complicated. I mean, the endocrine system, I'm sure you know, it's incredibly dynamic. It's very interactive. This idea that you could just tweak one thing and you tweak one thing in that system, the whole system moves. It's like a whole interconnected network. So I'm very respectful of hormones. I don't think they're not to be treated trivially, but I also think that it's a very individual thing how someone experiences menopause. It's absolutely not appropriate to have judgments of women for the way that they manage it. And I would say to anyone thinking about HRT to make sure you work with an experienced practitioner, because it's complicated, hormone replacement. It's not something you can just use a one-size-fits-all template for.
I like what you say there. What you said there. How it's very important to respect how different people are going to experience menopause, because especially here in the health space, a lot of times we have a victimization or a victim mentality when it comes to disease, and menopause is actually not a disease. This actually sets me up for one of the questions that I've been dying to ask you. How come guys don't have a menopause, a definitive period when they stop producing sperm, and how come, women do? What is the evolutionary reasoning behind stopping at a certain age? Because other mammals can reproduce until really late into their life cycles.
Yeah, it's more common. In fact, the animals that have a menopause are extremely rare. There is only, in fact, us, bluefin pilot whales, and orcas. That's it.
That's it? Everyone else can reproduce until their, late stages in life?
Going.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a very unusual phenomenon. So what we do notice with humans, of course, is that chromosomal defects become more and more common with later age pregnancies. So there's a pressure against that from an evolutionary perspective. There are pressures toward it, probably to continue reproducing, the pressures of having more experienced females modeling motherhood to younger mothers. I mean, that might also be a value, but clearly it's not as much of a value. From an evolutionary perspective, the trade-off doesn't weigh up against the chromosomal defect issue for humans. For other animals, it does. So, elephants are a really interesting example because they don't have a menopause, so the females can reproduce up until they die. They too are extremely intelligent mammals. They learn from one another. They are clearly very social, very tightly bonded in their familial groups. And what they've found studying older female elephants who have infants is that they have a higher grandchild survival rate. So that it seems like that modeling of motherhood to younger mothers in elephants is advantageous from an evolutionary perspective. In humans, it's very complicated because actually what we see is it changing with different forms of social structure. So that there's research on the Hadza hunter-gatherers in northern Tanzania that has looked at the survival rate of grandchildren with postmenopausal grandmothers. And those children have a higher survival rate. So it's clearly beneficial in hunter-gatherer context for there to be women who don't have their own children, who are past that and are looking after grandchildren. But when we try to replicate that finding in agricultural societies, and there have been a number of big studies that have looked at this. There was a Finnish one that was done in the early 2000s, another very big one looking at 19th century data on grandmothers in Utah. And both of these studies failed to find the grandmother hypothesis being confirmed. Right? This is the hypothesis generated by anthropologists to explain why we have menopause, because it might be that older women who don't have their own children can help the grandchildren to survive. So we see that effect in the hunter-gatherers of the Hadza. We don't see it in 19th century agricultural societies of Utah or Finland. What we see instead is that the grandmothers, postmenopausal grandmothers, have a lower grandchild survival rate. You're better off not to have a grandmother.
Not learn your mistakes.
So what's going on there? Clearly, there's a very important change that occurs in the way that older women can be helpful for survival. It really just does seem to depend on the environmental context. And importantly, in agricultural societies, you do see a much greater reliance on the knowledge and resources of older adults. They are absolutely crucial to the social grouping. And that in modern cultures, from the agricultural period onwards, we have created a society of relative redundancy of the elderly. And that is probably more so today than ever before. We no longer have a real place for the elderly in the social structures that we've created. And I think that is one of the big challenges of aging in modern cultures, that we had this idea that as you get old, you're just not useful.
Wow, and you're probably leeching resources rather than contributing.
Yeah, it clearly is just something where there are different, depending on the environment, there are different pressures. So that, what's advantageous for the hunter-gatherer is not necessarily so in the agricultural context, and even less so in the industrial one.
Because, my mind immediately went to energy expenditure, and how it is just so resource draining to have a kid. So like nursing and taking care of, but obviously that's not the case because elephants, having an elephant baby would be equally as energy draining, and yet they don't have a menopausal period. Because that was like in my head, that in my simplistic way is like, oh, having a baby takes a lot of resources, both physiologically and then in the resources of like feeding and gathering food and whatever. And with guys, we don't have those limitations because producing sperm is very, very cost effective,
Yes, that's right. It doesn't take that much energy.
Yeah, it doesn't take it, but
growing a whole baby takes a lot of energy.
Yeah, so there's definitely way more. There are other factors that are affecting this climactic or menopausal stage.
Yeah, well, it's also the chromosomal defects seem to be much more weighted towards women. So an old man can father children with a younger woman without chromosomal defects. It's not much difference as a man gets older from that point of view. For women, it's dramatic, so that every year after 35, there's a significant drop in likelihood of having a healthy baby from the point of view of chromosomal defects.
So personally, what are you doing in order to prepare yourself for this change? Nothing? Just like living a more hunter-gatherer, like, eating and moving and...
Yeah. I don't think there's much... I live the way I do for other reasons. I don't have a special strategy for avoiding menopause symptoms. I just live to be as well as I can. And I sort of think that it's important to, not to worry about it, to be honest, because one of the things I found really interesting thinking about with this topic is the potential for there to be a nocebo effect. In that we know that, for example, with the prostate drug, which is an androgen inhibitor, finasteride, that there are sexual side effects for men taking that drug. Of around 15% of men, they will experience erectile dysfunction and loss of libido. But that's 15% if you don't tell them about the side effect. If you tell the men about the side effect, that rate goes up to 44%. So I tend to think probably something is a bit similar with menopause, in that you have someone who they're going to have certain symptoms no matter what they're told. You have a small percentage of women who are going to have a hard time no matter what they're told. And then you have a percentage of women who will experience they won't even notice. There'll just be this one less thing to worry about, and that's all they'll notice. And then you have a bunch of women in between who could probably swing either way. And so if you tell those women that there's this big scary thing that's going to happen to them, everything's going to change, it's going to be awful, and you're really going to have a miserable time, and you won't know who you are, and you'll get fab, and you tell them all this stuff to make them worry, you could very easily swing them toward having a negative experience. And that is the power of nocebo. It is a documented thing, as powerful as placebo.
There's a fascinating paper that it's a case study on this kid who was, who wasn't happy with himself and took a bunch of pills, and they took him to the emergency department, and they couldn't control his blood pressure. They didn't know what he had taken. He was in a lot of trouble. So they looked at the prescription. They didn't know what it was, and he was part of a research trial. So they called in one of the researchers, and when he matched them to the records, he told the kid who was unconscious, "You're part of the placebo." And all of a sudden, within hours, his blood pressure stabilized. He came back. And
Interesting.
But I'll send you the link to that thing. It's pretty impressive. And the kid didn't know. And when he was informed that they had to stop the trial, I guess, with him because he was in such trouble, and they told him that he was part of the placebo, he physiologically was able to regulate his blood pressure and become stable. So the nocebo effect is amazing, and it's just as amazing as the placebo effect.
I really wonder about this, in ancestral health communities and paleo communities where people are very conscious of all of the negative things that are impacting us in modern life ways, right? Are we actually in danger sometimes of stimulating a nocebo effect? Because it means that then on those occasions where maybe you eat something you know that isn't the best for you, you suffer more knowing what it's doing to your body.
or vice versa, that we're doing all of this, walking barefoot, and it's actually not doing anything physiologically, but because we believe it's good for us, it's actually yeah.
Oh, look, take it if you can get it. I mean,
totally. Oh no, I look for placebo effect as much as I can in my life all the time. Yeah. Now, you before we started the conversation, you were telling me about your next project, and can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm working on about 3 things at once.
Specifically, the book about genitalia.
Oh, so that's kind of the previous project that I'm still finishing. Yeah. So the menopause sexual aging stuff is the new work that I'm doing, but at the moment I'm finishing a little book. Which is looking at the term genitalia and how it emerged and how we thought about it through history. Because a lot of the ancient medical literature has a very different concept to what you see emerging in early Christianity. And I just have a sense that some of those definitions that appear end up being quite important to the way people think about sexuality. So we'll see when that gets finished.
When did it become icky, or when did it become shameful, to have genitalia?
Well, funnily enough, you have the word genitalia in Latin really from the early Roman period, and there's a ancient Greek term that appears to be the equivalent of it. But then in the first few centuries, in the Common Era, you find a new word being used interchangeably with genitalia in Latin, which is pudenda. We have this word in English, pudenda. It's not very common. Most people won't throw that around. Suck my pudenda. But pudenda means shameful, the shameful parts. And so this is the term that you find in the work of St. Augustine, for example, when he's describing the Genesis fall from the Garden of Eden and how Adam and Eve had these genitalia, right? They were given these with their bodies by God. But in the fall from the Garden of Eden and the transgression of God's will, their genitalia become pudenda. So the idea is in that whole Christian mythology that the genitals, since the fall, have their own will. So Adam and Eve were able to control their genitals, Augustine thought. Adam could have an erection just as he could lift his finger. He could completely control it. But after the fall, we are at the mercy of these body parts that have themselves their own will, and they try to make us sin, and we have to resist that constantly.
So this is about the time that the Bible was written, and what about before that? We were talking about like ancient Roman and Greek societies, and there wasn't as much shame to genitalia.
No, well, they weren't even really thought of as the place where desire was generated. So, is what I was saying to you before, that like the ancient Greek concept. I mean, in Aristotle, the genitalia are simply this point where the seed banks up before it has to be released, but the pleasure, he thought, came from somewhere else. And he thought it probably came from the area around the diaphragm, around the heart, because he thought that was the kind of center of the body. And then in the early Roman period, you find scholars like Galen referring to the testes as the place where the seed comes from and where pleasure comes from. And he too thought that the genitals were just where the energy banks up before it is released. So that neither of those thinkers considered the genitalia really to matter very much in themselves. So that we would feel all the sensation there because that is where the energy is trying to get out.
In the United States, we have a lot of shame in comparison with like Europe. I don't know where Australia is in all of this, but like I remember vividly many years ago when the movie Troy came out, Brad Pitt fighting this huge giant kind of a thing, and like almost like David and Goliath like. And like they send your best warrior, and then Brad Pitt, comes in with his sword, runs up to him, sticks the sword in his neck, and within 30 seconds, this giant is defeated, and is like, "Who's next?" Whatever. Like everyone claps. Next scene is Brad Pitt sleeping with two girls. I remember sitting at the theater, like watching this movie, and everyone's cheering, and as soon as the sex scene comes on, this dad with his kid is like closing her eyes, like, don't look at that, which is really funny because you're seeing this dude get like completely killed, but you can't see two humans having intercourse. I guess three humans. So there's a lot of shame within the United States, and then I hear stories about going to Europe, and then like women are shown half naked and on national TV, and there is like less censorship. Did you trace that back, or why that is? Is it strictly religious?
Well, there's a lot of variation. I mean, there probably is a bit more, a bit less of a thing about nudity in most European cultures, but you could certainly find people who would be offended by it as well. And I would say in the US you'd have a lot of variation too. You'd have people who were deeply morally conservative about sexual matters, and then you'd have a lot of people who were not at all and quite comfortable talking about it. And so I think it's hard to generalize about these things. I mean, certainly in European cinematic traditions, you have a lot more acceptable nudity on beaches. It's more acceptable to be naked. I think Australia is probably more like the US in that regard. There's perhaps for reasons to do with religious origins, but not necessarily. I remember a French friend who came to visit me a number of years ago. We went to the beach, and we had to get changed into our bathers, and she just took all her clothes off on the beach and put her bathers on. And the convention is to go to the change rooms and put your bathers on and come out. And but to her, it was just perfectly normal to take everything off on the beach.
What made you start looking into genitalia as a subject matter?
Well, I was just struck by, I'm always interested in terms, concepts and the words that we invent to describe them, and why we can suddenly have a word referring to a particular thing without that word having existed before. And so I'm always curious about, when we have a new word, is it a completely new concept, or has the concept in some sense already formed and it just needed that word to, really express it. So I'm always tracking things like that historically. I've done that with a few different concepts.
Has the concept of genitalia changed, like from like the classical period, like the Greeks and the Romans, to the Dark Ages, to more modern periods? Has this concept of genitalia changed, not only in its meaning, but also in like its societal weight? Because like you see, I don't know if you watch Game of Thrones, but all this medieval shows or plays or movies or whatever, like there's, during the Dark Ages, there was like this half moral, half shame, and making funny jokes about genitalia that would not be as common even in more liberal societies, like like we have now.
Yeah, it really does depend in the social milieu where you look. So in the Middle Ages, you find a huge amount of referencing of genitalia in some of the vernacular sources. So the medieval French fabliaux, they're all jokes about people losing their genitals, so their genitals being disassociated from them, and they have to get them back. Or some women go to a market and they find that there are all these penises that they can shop for, or there are all these kinds of jokes. They're obsessed with genitals in that period. It's a major source of humor. And you also find them, even you can see today if you walk around churches in the Poitou-Charentes region in the northern center of France. There are churches with corbels, sculptural corbels on the outside of the church or even on the inside, and they are little statues of guys sucking their own dick or women pulling apart their labia, showing you their vagina. So these corbels are on the churches.
And that I don't think that's accepted anymore.
It's not clear whether they were accepted at the time. It's an ambiguous thing. So, I mean, the church obviously in that period was very prescriptive about sexual matters. They really wanted people to repress their desire and be vigilant against, the feelings of lust, right? So they really wanted to bring that message to the forefront of everyone's consciousness. So to them, the way you did that was by actually arousing people a little bit so that they could see how dangerous sex was. So for them, having those corbels with, very explicit sexual imagery, we think of it today like people who are morally conservative would never do that. They would generally want there to be no sexual imagery.
You just repress, yeah.
Yeah, the medieval church, it was different to that. Like, we can't take our moral conservatives to be what the medieval church would have looked like. They were very different then.
Now, you did say something really curious there, how dangerous would be to have the sexual desires. And it goes back to, our conversation of how expensive energetically is having a kid. And having, an extra kid could make or break you.
Well, typically, it looks like through most of human history up until industrialization, women were most commonly having somewhere in the range of 8 to 12 children. That was normal. So it doesn't look like they were generally regulating
birth control or anything like that.
Yeah, probably not.
Wow. And now you see, places like Japan that are having, less and less kids, and now they're at a deficit, and that's equally as dangerous.
It depends. You mean for society?
For society,
negative growth?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, easily make up for it with immigration. I mean, that's been what many countries have done as their births have been dropping. I mean, it's not like we need more people on the planet.
And that is the truth. That is the truth.
We maybe need to just move some around.
Yeah, or have a big virus or something.
As long as you're not one of the ones getting it, right?
Yeah, as long as I'm not the one getting it, I'm cool. So, where can people find your work? Where can people get your books? How can people get a hold of you?
Well, I've got an Amazon page, so if you look up Alison M on Amazon, you'll see my books there. or my Google Scholar page, Alison M also.
Yeah, that was fantastic reading through that.
Oh, really? Okay, great. They're probably the best places to keep in touch. I've got a staff web page at Western Sydney University as well, academia.edu. Yeah, I'm on a few different things.
And what is the next project that you're going to be working on?
Well, at the moment, I'm also collaborating with a Scottish literary scholar and a Norwegian gastroenterologist. And we're looking at the history of ideas about digestive health. So this is another area of great interest to me that I've had some interest in for a number of years.
It's so funny because I was having this exact conversation with someone today about how our ideas of gut health, like back in the day, the health started the gut, and like the gut was like the epicenter of all disease. And then we started compartmentalizing the body, and now you have like a thyroid and your neurological system, and now you have all these compartments, and now we're like experiencing a renaissance in like the gut health and being so important. So it would be so interesting to see how all of this crazy information, all these crazy amounts of information about gut health, like from things like SIBO, bone broth, dysbiosis, gut biomapping, is affecting our current health for the good and for the bad, because I do see a lot of patients that are like, I have candida, and I have candida overgrowth. I've read all the pages, I check all of the symptoms. And when you do objective testing, they don't have, they have normal levels of Candida albicans, or they might have, but they are so consumed by the information. So that would be super
Right.
interesting.
Yeah, look, that's a massive growth area in microbiology, the whole microbiome interaction thing. It's generally true, I think, when you look at the history of the science of digestive intestinal pathologies, that there's been a movement from identifying specific pathogens to seeing the gut as having its own ecology. So that in fact nothing is necessarily inherently pathogenic. It's about the balance. So you could have a very normal level of Candida albicans, but maybe you don't have enough of something else to help regulate it. So yeah, I think it really is worth thinking about gut ecology and about the whole spectrum of microorganisms that are there.
Are you familiar with the work of Michael Ruscio?
Oh yes, of course, yeah.
What he talks about, like we're trying to mimic the Hadza biome in a non-Hadza environment.
Yeah, you got to get some deer excrement in you if you want to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and some deer and tons of running and it's the different microbiomes might make your gut motility slower because of the level of fiber in the diet. And if you try to replicate that with a highly processed, nutritious diet, then you're going to overabsorb calories, and then you're going to be obese. And then you're going to have constipation, and that can cause intestinal permeability and autoimmune disease. So we cannot just copy the biome of another culture because that culture is healthy. We need to adapt our biomes to the best of our abilities, but again, the unfiltered amount of information that is pouring off of PubMed and Facebook and Instagram, it could be a really bad nocebo effect.
There are also plenty of people out there now experimenting with DIY fecal transplants.
And
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
That is so scary. That is so scary. Because what if you use the wrong blender?
Mm-hmm.
You're making your smoothie. Oh crap! Literally. And again, information is amazing, and I'm not insinuating that we need to limit the access to information, but we should be very judicious with the self-experimentation that we are willing to do with ourselves, because like in reality we don't know. You can easily, you just Google, fecal transplant instructions, and you can find fecal transplant instructions. And if you share your microbiome, you're also sharing neurotransmitters, and you're also sharing, all of these different things that could significantly affect you for the rest of your life. Well, Allison, it's been a pleasure to have you on my show.
So fun.
What is the any new presentations, any new conferences you're attending?
No, I'm in a bit of an introspective phase for the next few months, just trying to get a book written and then going on a writing retreat on a Greek island.
That's awesome.
So it probably won't be out. I really would like to get to the Ancestral Health Symposium again. That was a great experience. I loved attending that. So I'll be keeping an eye out for when the next one is.
Totally. And when your next product drops, just send to me, and I'll share it with all my listeners so we can get this information out for everyone.
Fabulous. Thank you, Guillermo. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.